Well, welcome. We are so glad that you are here with us, whether this is day or night, whenever you are watching this. We are so glad we're here. Just so you know, we love you, we care about you, and that's why we're on this channel. I'm going to dive right into it. We are going to be answering the question, who am I? Now, as a pastor, especially as a youth pastor, I get this question probably more than any other. Is this question of who am I? Where am I going? I'm about to graduate from high school. I don't know what my career is. I don't know what school I'm going to. This question of who am I is a question that I'm sure a lot of you are asking or are going to ask yourself at some point in your lives. And I'm hoping that in the next 5 minutes or so, we're going to be able to tackle this question in a very simple way, but hopefully in a very deep way. And so I want to read for you out of Ephesians chapter 4. I just want to read a couple verses out of there. And this is Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus. Now that's important to note because while Paul is writing this to the church, nothing's really going on. In fact, Paul is actually just reminding them of who they are and who they're supposed to be as a church and who they're supposed to be as Christians. So I want to read this to you again. Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 17, it says this. Now this I say and testify in the Lord, that you must no longer walk as the Gentiles do. In the futility of their minds, they are darkened in their understanding, alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them. Due to the hardness of their hearts, they have become callous and have given themselves up to sensuality, greedy of every kind of practice of impurity. But that is not the way you learned Christ, assuming that you have heard about him and were taught in him, as the truth is in Jesus. Remember that. Verse 21 there, remember that. This is the truth is in Jesus. To put off your old self, which belongs to your former manner of life, and is corrupt through deceitful desires, to be renewed in the spirits of your mind, and to put on the new self, created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. Now, what Paul is reminding the church is that their old self, as you read, is callous, is greedy, is darkened and alienated in their understanding. So there's this definite contrast of old self versus new self, because the new self is made in the likeness of God, in that righteousness and holiness. And that word holiness can actually be translated or maybe even looked at a little different way of being separate, of being separated, of being set apart. So holiness is someone that is set apart from others. Now, in the ultimate sense of the word, God is the only one that is holy, but through Jesus, we can actually also be called holy as we are made in his likeness. Now, if you know anything about the Old Testament, you know the story of Moses at all. When Moses is off in the wilderness and God meets with him and the fiery bush comes to him and Moses is supposed to go back to Egypt. And what does God say? When Moses says, who should I say is sending me? God answers, just tell them that I am is sending you. Now, you may hear that and go, that's ridiculous. Who's going to know who I am? Well, what God is saying there is I am simply who I am. God doesn't change. God doesn't grow. God doesn't have to change. He is perfect. He is holy. He is set apart. And that's important to note because like I said, in verse 21 where it says the truth is in Jesus, we can trust that God doesn't change. God doesn't make mistakes. God doesn't say something and then go back on it a little bit later. God is who he is and he says what he means. And so as we answer this question of who am I? Well, we have to ask the question, really, who does Jesus say that you are? And his love letter to us, this Bible right here, his love letter to us says so many things about how God feels about you. Right here, right now, how God feels about you. And some of those things, just some of them, you are called loved. You are called a child of the Most High God. You are called a friend. You are called justified, redeemed, free, accepted. You are actually called a saint, righteous, made new, an heir to the throne, blessed, forgiven. Now, that may seem crazy because we look at our lives and we say, how can God ever love me? I've done all these horrible, terrible things in my life. Or maybe on the opposite end of the spectrum, you're thinking, man, I'm a good person. I'm not as bad as this person over here. But if we believe Paul's words in the book of Romans where he says, not one is righteous, not one is righteous. That means that our righteousness comes through Jesus alone, and so our identity needs to come through Jesus alone. As I wrap this question up of who am I? Who am I? As we answer this question kind of once and for all, you need to know how God feels about you. In fact, there's a beautiful passage in Zephaniah 3 where the writer of Zephaniah is actually saying this. This is how God feels about you. This is in verse 17 in chapter 3. It says this, "The Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save." Now listen to this. "He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you by his love. He will exult over you with loud singing." This is not some small thing. God loves you so much, and he cares about you so much right where you are. No, you don't have to be perfect. Right as you come to him right here, right now, that's how God feels about you. This is not a small thing. In fact, God rejoices over you. He finds gladness in you. Now, that's an amazing thing. So we cannot, hear me, friends, we cannot believe the lies that people tell us about ourselves. We can't believe the lies and the fact that we are deceived by our own thoughts and who we say we are. I want to challenge and encourage you after you've read this to go back and read Ephesians 4. Read Zephaniah 3. Because we have to believe not in what other people say or even what we say about ourselves. You have to understand that that's how God feels about you. And you need to read about what Jesus says about you and who you are to him. And frankly, he loves you a whole lot more than you could possibly think or imagine.